Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this 29th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture, one in the series of the University of Tasmania Island of Ideas forums. I'm going to begin with the acknowledgement of country, which I'll read from the university's statement. We're in university space. As a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Palawa people. And the Richard Jones Memorial Lecture Committee would join with that acknowledgement. The Palawa are the original and traditional custodians of the land from which we're broadcasting today. We pay our deepest respect to elders past, present and emerging, and those who did not make elder status. We acknowledge the deep history of storytelling, knowledge, sharing and caring for land. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights. And if you're joining us tonight on the online, you are welcome to put your acknowledgements by typing into the Q&A function. So I'm Margaret Stedman, and I'm actually channeling Corey Peterson, who's unwell. So I'm jumping into the space of MC. I'm a member of the Richard Jones Memorial Lecture Committee, and also President of Sustainable Living Tasmania, which has been associated with the lectures from their very beginning. So we're broadcasting across Lutruwita, Tasmania and the world. Who knows where the online people are coming from. But for those of you who are in the room today, there's a few housekeeping things. Please turn off your mobile phone onto silent or switch it off. And if you are an online viewer, please note that your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled in order to protect your privacy. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function. And you can see that at the bottom of your screen. I think most people are now very used to doing webinars online and you know what to do. And you can type your questions anonymously if you wish. We'll address as many questions as possible as we can from both the online and the in-room audience. And just a reminder that the lecture is being recorded and that the questions will also be recorded. So, welcome to this 29th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture, and a particular welcome to Patsy Jones and the Jones tribe, which is sitting in the front. Thank you for being here again. And the lecture this evening is, are the Paris climate goals still attainable? We're really grateful in the Richard Jones Memorial Lecture to the UTAS events team, who have enormously helped in the organisation of this. They've taken on over the last few years the nitty-gritty organising of this event, and it's been a huge boon and relief to us. So thank you very much to Sarah and her crew for helping us with this. And it's useful to remind ourselves of the Richard Jones legacy. It's still with us. It's a live legacy. It began in 1987, and this special annual event pays tribute to the late Dr. Richard Jones, who made a significant contribution to environmental awareness in Australia and beyond. He became a dominant early figure in the environmental movement that emerged in Tasmania, and in the early 70s he was founding chairman of the Lake Purdah Action Committee, which fought to save the lake from inundation, and of the United Tasmania Group, the world's first green political party. These groups provided the groundwork for the later successful national campaign to prevent the damming of the Franklin River. He was instrumental in establishing the community-based Tasmanian Environment Centre, which is now Sustainable Living Tasmania, and played a leading role in converting the Australian Conservation Foundation into one of the nation's most dynamic environmental organisations. Both of those organisations are still working hard. In establishing the Postgraduate Centre for Environmental Studies at the University of Tasmania, Dr. Jones did much to promote problem-oriented, interdisciplinary environmental research that's provided the community with valuable information and innovative ideas. And that's the work that we're honouring now, and the work that many people are continuing. We're delighted that Dr. Matthew Ives is here with us this evening. He's the Director for Economic Strategy for the Department of the Premier and Cabinet in South Australia, and an Associate at Oxford University's Institute for New Economic Thinking. While pursuing net zero energy and green growth for South Australia, Dr. Ives engaged in various research programs at Oxford, applying complexity economics to promote a rapid, low-carbon transition and sustainable economic growth. He's worked in academia as well as private and public sectors on a diversity of programs related to economic sustainability on land, air and sea. And his past ventures include assessing global and national decarbonisation pathways in Australia and the UK, modelling long-term infrastructure strategies for water, energy, waste and transport for the UK and the United Nations, developing sustainability indicators for the US Forest Service, and modelling the sustainability of fisheries in Tasmania. Tonight we'll hear about his work at the University of Oxford on sensitive intervention points in socio-economic systems that trigger profound impacts. That's what I'm hoping to hear, that there are other things happening in the world other than political inaction. He'll uncover the evidence that suggests learning by doing. Actually, maybe this is telling you his talk. I should stop there, Matthew, and just invite you to come out and actually tell us what you want to say.
Hi, everyone. Just thinking about what Margaret said there, I've been in the game of sustainability for 20, 30 years, and I was at a talk in Oxford where some people were presenting on artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics. And it was an incredibly optimistic and bright future for these people. And at the end of the talk, I put up my hand and I said, I'm from the world of environmental management and sustainability, and every day you get bad news stories about bees dying and more deforestation. And how is it that you are on the same planet as me? Like, you are so optimistic about your future. And it struck me some months after that, by pondering that maybe there is a way we can combine these two worlds, that these two worlds might be able to meet. And I think that's the story I'm here to tell today, that this isn't a techno-fix story, but technology is part of the story, because technology is a big part of the problem. This is some work that I've been involved in Oxford, and I was very fortunate to be working with the likes of Professor Doan Farmer and Rupert Way, Dr. Rupert Way and Dr. Penny Muley, incredibly intelligent people. So much of the glow of this talk, if you have any warm feelings afterwards, should also go to my co-authors, save a little bit for me. And it's based on about a decade's worth of work around technological progress that Doan Farmer, who's an amazing guy, he was one of the founders of chaos theory, and you'll see the inklings of that sort of world of dynamical systems in this talk. So just to go over the talk very quickly, I'll be going through what the Paris goals are as quickly as possible, because I'm told you're a very informed audience, so hopefully I don't have to go into too much detail there. And the climate challenge, the concept of sensitive intervention points, and then how it might apply to the climate change problem, what decision makers are currently being told about climate mitigation pathways, what is probably wrong with that story, Is there a better perspective? I'm convinced that there is, and what the implications are that for the cost of the new transition to the global energy system, and then something about the regional perspective, because I always get questions about that, and then some conclusions. So the Paris Climate Goals, an amazing moment to see the world coming together with an ambition that was actually, in some ways, it was informed by the science, but it took the science by surprise. I had some of the leading IPCC people at Oxford with me, and they came back quite stunned by the ambition of the Paris Agreement, which, and this is the piece that I'll be talking to, is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. There's a lot more to the Paris Agreement, but I'm going to focus on that goal. And you probably have heard from Margaret and read in the papers that there's some real despondency that's come out of COP27, possibly COP26 as well, which was meant to be one of the ratchet years where we ratchet up our ambition, and people perhaps didn't see enough of that. And you know, I really feel for the coming generation that they're seeing their world going up in smoke, literally. And I want to say that I may be giving somewhat of a picture of hope, and hopefully I do have you feeling a little bit more hopeful after this talk, but that's not to take away the seriousness of the challenge that we have ahead of us. There is one piece of it that I think is, I've heard from the Extinction Revolution, that the scientists are perhaps not giving enough of the risks associated with climate change. One particular component of that is around the possibility of tipping points, the possibility that we can set off these feedback dynamics in the climate system that could be runaway and could lead to further global warming and further changes. And we're already getting close to the point of the loss of major systems like coral reefs around the world. So one of those feedback dynamics, just as an example, is the permafrost bomb, as they call the methane bomb, which is the idea that substantial components of the northern hemisphere are covered by permafrost. It's quite a lot of land. It's about the size of Canada and China and the US combined. That has in a lot of organic matter that has been stalled in its process of decomposing. And if that ice starts melting, then that will be releasing a lot more CO2 and methane. And the problem with permafrost is it's involved in a feedback dynamic, that the more global warming you get, the more permafrost melts you get, the more greenhouse gases you get released, the more global warming you get, which means more permafrost melt. You've got that feedback dynamic. And that is one of the chief concerns of some of the parties associated with some of the more revolutionary protest movements. And it is a concern. I've looked into the literature more recently. I've actually addressed it to one of the leading scientists at Oxford, who is a part of the IPCC movement, and he has said to me, and I've looked at his literature, that this is accommodated in the models, but like so much of the climate change story, there are huge uncertainties. There's huge uncertainties in these models. If you look at these outputs of these models, there's a lot of difference between them in terms of the outputs that they present and how difficult this challenge is. And generally, that's how you come up with gives us a 50% chance of reaching 1.5 degrees. That's 50% of the models get below 1.5 degrees. That's what it means. And so there's different perspectives on whether these feedback dynamics are really genuinely fully incorporated into the climate models. And so that is, I think, part of the concern. But the reason why I bring that up is because that's actually part of the positive story too. Because the research that I was involved in around sensitive intervention points, which is the brainchilds of Professor Darren Farmer and Cameron Hepburn, is one of the few times that I have seen in the environmental movement a positive story. And they, when they first presented it, I was sold immediately and wanted to be a part of this. And it was one of the best jobs of my life and a fantastic journey. And I'm very grateful to them for putting this inspirational work out there. We got some work published in Science, so huge impact journal. I was very happy to see the editors put Greta Thunberg there on as the picture that's associated with our publication, because she's a very good example of what we're trying to say, which is those feedback dynamics don't just exist in the climate system. They also exist in our socioeconomic systems, and they can be extremely powerful. As I mentioned, Dane was involved early on in chaos theory. You've possibly heard of the idea of the butterfly effect, the idea that a small impact early on in the system can have profound impacts, even in a system that is rigid in its determinism. You can still get vast differences from a small change in the initial conditions. It's known as the butterfly effect and characterized by the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in some part of the land can have a profound impact on something as big as a tornado somewhere else in the climate system. And look at that story of Greta Thunberg. She's a 16-year-old girl protesting out of the front of the Swedish Parliament alone. Through the magnifying effect of social media, she gives birth to a global phenomenon, a movement, the Sunrise Movement in the US and the Fridays for Future movement that happened here, that I believe is attributed to allowing Biden to win the election over Trump, who was a climate denier and took them out of Paris. So Biden then joins America back into Paris and invests in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the largest investments in clean energy technology that any country is involved in, except for the US, China, of course, and I'll get to that. But how's that for a story of the butterfly effect? This is one girl on her own protesting out the front of Swedish Parliament, and she has impacted the elections in the US, one of the most powerful countries on earth. And that is the story that I'm going to tell here, that these dynamics do exist in our socioeconomic system. This is a piece of work from someone else. I'm showing you this to show we're not the only ones that think this is the case, that there are other scientists that are working in this space that have shown that there are these feedback dynamics. The one on the far left there, I think it's your left, yes, about the opinion dynamics, social conformity feedback. I can imagine not all of those young people were necessarily that passionate about climate change, but having their friends, having it so much on their Facebook feed would have brought them into it. So that's that viral feedback dynamic that made something so small turn into something so large. And there's quite a few of them in our socioeconomic systems, and they can be a force for positive. And that is what we were working on. It was what we called these sensitive intervention points that can trigger some of these dynamics. In our research, we came to the conclusion that some of them can be kicked into action. Say, for instance, subsidising low-cost renewables. You put a certain amount of investment in them. They have a feedback dynamic known as learning by doing, that once they get to the point of a tipping point where they're economically the most viable option, then they start rolling on their own. So you get them over that hump and then they start making progress on their own. A shift is another sort of dynamic, and the UK Climate Change Act is an example of that, in that you kind of change the rules of the game when you put in a piece of legislation, and that's one of the most powerful triggers that you have for change. It may not necessarily be easy, but it's an interesting story of how that UK Climate Change Act, I'd encourage you to read about that, on how that happened and how they got bipartisan support for that, and how it's very unlikely that'll ever change. And the feedback dynamic there is expectations, and the expectations of people that in business communities that progress will be made. And if you look at the UK, they have made a lot of progress in decarbonisation. Still big challenges ahead, but that's an example of how you can get a shift in the system that is a sensitive intervention point. We looked into what are the characteristics of these sensitive intervention points. In the case of the Climate Change Act, that was a window of opportunity. There was a criticality in the system. They had bipartisan agreement. There was a NGO that seized the opportunity, got the business community behind it. And once they got that act in, it was very difficult for any party to then get rid of it. And whether there's hysteresis in the system, so it's not easily reversed. Australia, we had an ETS early on, and I'm still a little bit angry with the Greens movement for them not going with Howard's ETS earlier on, because you just start it low, just like they did in the EU, and then you build it up over time. And so the EU's in a much better position than we are. But when we got that ETS during the Gillard leadership, Tony Abbott used that as an opportunity to take over, and it flipped back. So that didn't have hysteresis to it. So we're looking for interventions that could have that hysteresis, and also how difficult it is to actually trigger one of these sensitive intervention points. How much money do you have to invest in a kick? And does this intervention bring about the speed and scale of impact? A lot of people ask me with the despondency, do we have enough time? You know, it's looking like an impossible task. So we were looking for interventions that could have this kind of scale of impact, and interventions that don't have too much uncertainty around their impact, don't have too much in terms of trade-offs and unintended consequences. An example of that would be the just transition. If we have a transition that only works for some and some gain much more than others, then that's problematic. That's a risk to that intervention. And another key component is that what I talked about earlier, the idea of a positive feedback dynamic, because that's how you get outsized results in a dynamic system. And they're very powerful forces, as you'll see in my talk. And we came up with a number of examples of those intervention points in our paper. There's strategic legislation on climate change, as the Climate Change Act is. That is actually a bit of a kick and a shift. That's an example of a shift. Ending fossil fuel exploration, that has happened in a few countries, Belgium, for instance. Stopping the extraction permitting of fossil fuels, that has happened in another few countries. But it's very difficult to make that happen politically. Only one person has to sign the paper, but they've got a lot of pressure on them to not sign that piece of paper. Subsidising new clean technologies or removing fossil fuel subsidies is another kick to the system. And then improved financial disclosure of climate risk. That's a big one that's happened only just recently. Mark Carney of the Bank of England spearheaded that with Mike Bloomberg, and that's really having massive rippling effects through the financial community and ESG reporting. And really, there's a lot of funds, actually more funds than we need available for investments in clean technology. So that's a positive situation. What the examples that I've given there are important also for one other reason, is that they're all leading to one positive feedback dynamic, and that's learning by doing associated with clean energy. And that's the one piece of work that we really focused on. We could have modeled all of these different systems, but this is the one that we focused on, because so many of them led to this feedback dynamic being triggered, and then the momentum that it creates. So how does this story differ from what decision makers are actually being told about climate mitigation pathways? This is hopefully, and I'm presenting science here, so I hope you're okay with me presenting graphs. There's a few of them, graphs as science, so hopefully you're not too disturbed by these graphs. I'll try and do a decent job of presenting them. This is our emissions in the black line going up, our annual emissions globally. We're up to about 40 gigatons a year now. And if we continue on that trajectory, you get up into those hell states of catastrophic warming above 4 degrees. If we manage to turn that boat around and reduce our emissions dramatically, we can get to those Paris targets of less than 2 degrees Celsius. We don't have a problem with that fan of uncertainty that it's showing. That is actually a good indication of the level of uncertainty associated with not just the technology, but also the socioeconomic system. You know, there's conditions there around how much we cooperate as countries, and you can see problems associated with that happening right now. So that is a good indication of the uncertainty associated with it. Our problem really is to do with the characterisation of those less than 2 degrees pathways and how difficult it is for us to achieve it in the models that are used to present this story. In the models, basically, in order to achieve the less than 2 degrees or any emissions reductions, you put a carbon tax on it. And the idea is that a carbon tax is a shadow version of any sort of policy you might put in, that any policy is going to have a certain cost to it that's like a carbon tax. So if you just use a carbon tax as the one lever, it kind of covers all the others. That has problems in itself, but that's not my key problem. It's just that what that tells you is that when you pull on that lever, that basically puts brakes on the economy. Your economic growth suffers, and that's one way you bring your emissions down. There's also incentives to move to other technologies, but they're not necessarily less expensive. And so you can actually cost more to do that transition. On top of that, impact economic growth. Another good way of doing it is reducing our energy usage. That's an obvious one in terms of reducing your emissions. And if you manage to pull on those levers as hard as possible, and even if you're in the most optimistic scenario about how we all work together to make this happen, the sustainability scenario is what they call it. Even in that scenario, in the IPCC models, you've still got to build 13 gigatons or more of carbon capture and storage by 2100. I will talk a bit more about that, but that's a piece of kit that costs money that you have to add to your power generation. So because it costs money to do that, your electricity is going to cost more if you use those solutions. And the other problem with carbon capture and storage is, as I said, it's a piece of kit you add onto your power station. It pulls out the flue gas, it concentrates the CO2 and it sticks it underground. To do that, you need energy, so they require some extra energy. You need extra water then for cooling, and currently that's a very expensive operation. So there's not too many around the world. There is one in Canada that currently sequesters 1 megaton per year of CO2. In order to meet that most ambitious scenario, 13 gigatons a year, we have to build one of those at least every 3 days for the next 80 years to achieve that. If we use the high economic growth scenario and we try to meet that 1.5 degrees, we have to build one every day for the next 80 years. Now, not even the groups that are supportive of CCS as a solution will tell you that that's feasible. They believe that that's only going to address about 9% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So what's wrong with that story, apart from the fact that it sounds impossible to achieve? Well, one problem is that the models have been systematically biased against some of the technologies that we believe are a big part of the future. You're aware, hopefully, of the dramatic costs over the last few decades of PV costs. That's those costs coming down in the black line there. That's a logarithmic graph. So the International Energy Agency's projections through the years are shown there in the different colours. And that top projection from 2001, their projection for the costs of solar in 2020 now, on that graph, are more than an order of magnitude above what they are now. So their projection said it was going to be $800 per megawatt hour. It's now 80. So a huge difference in terms of what they are projecting will happen with the costs of solar as opposed to what happened. And as you can see, all those lines of all those projections are only one side of that actual line. There's a systematic bias in the way that they are presenting these projections. There's not one of those lines on the left-hand side where they're overly optimistic about what solar prices are going to do. So there's a systematic bias in their system. The fact that it's got a straight line, the actual there, on a logarithmic curve means that it's an exponential decline. That's an exponential trend. It'll taper off as it gets closer to zero. But the fact that their lines are also straight means they are actually taking in that feedback dynamic, because it's that feedback dynamic that leads to the exponential decline, an exponential change. And that feedback dynamic is that around learning by doing. So the more you deploy of a good, the more you learn from doing that, the more the costs come down. The more the costs come down, the more people demand of that good, the more niche markets you can find for that work with the costs that they're at, the more you deploy it. The more you deploy it, the more you learn. And if the indication that you've got one of those feedback dynamics is you've got a straight line on that logarithmic graph. So that's one point. Another is, and this is showing some of the graphics from the IPCC from the previous report, not the current one. So it's showing what they projected in the past, their estimates of where PV costs would be in the future and in their model. And that's how they modeled it. What you can see there when you contrast it against what actually happened is that a lot of those lines are well above where the cost actually went. And these are really big models, like bigger than anything I've worked on. I've worked on big beasts of models. No one person understands the whole model. There's whole teams working on it. People leave the teams. Assumptions that are in the model may not have been documented well. So it's really hard to manage them. And I really sympathise with the people that manage these systems. And they've got to get them out every 5 years or so in order to report on them. And they're really hard to update. And so they become out of date very quickly, as you can see. And the problem here is that not only are they out of date for where they are now, the costs in 2050 in most of their models above where the costs are now. So you can imagine these models are going to project a heck of a lot less solar than would be the case if they got those projections right. And one of the other things you might see is that they're all converging around that point there, around 50 megawatts per hour. There's possibly a reason for that, because that's the tipping point. That's around the area where they reach price parity with most of the fossil fuels available on the planet. Because if you allow them to actually tip over that, these models have a certain economic rationality to them. They'll start spending all their money on solar and wind and these other renewables. They'll tip completely to these other systems. So there's a certain belief in the community that world is not a viable world. So there is a bias in the community against some of these technologies. And another way they deal with those kind of non-linear dynamics is they put floor costs on solar, for instance. And these lines that I'm showing you there are the floor costs they've put in the models that we pulled out through time, and the actual costs breaking through those floor costs. And then they just lower them. And we've searched for the explanations of how they've justified these, and a lot of them are around expert elicitation. So there are experts involved that are making these predictions, but you can see they're getting them wrong. And we haven't seen yet any really concrete evidence as to where that floor cost is. So one of the reasons they explain why they do that is to deal with the increasing returns to scale effect, these nonlinear dynamics, and how to actually rein them in the model to prevent them from coming up with solutions that they just don't believe in. And there's another component that I've talked to the modelers of this that is not in it. Beyond the learning by doing, there's certain components to learning by doing. Economies of scale is one of them. Another is complementary technologies, and it's an important one that's in our model that we use to replace this and update what we believe is a problem with the models. And that is that some technologies are complementary in their feedback dynamics. You've seen the learning by doing associated with renewables that I've talked about. Well, the more renewables you get, the cheaper the electricity you get, the cheaper it is to have an EV. The more EVs you got, the more you invest and deploy in battery technologies. The more batteries, the cheaper batteries become, the better you can incorporate renewables plus storage on the grid and deal with the intermittency of renewables. So you've got this big feedback dynamic between complementary technologies, which is a big part of our model, which I know is not in and some of these other models that are being used. So is there better perspective? You've probably heard it already in what I've said. I believe there is. And this is the work that I was involved in that we've recently have published. And And I believe it's one of the best pieces of work that I'll ever get involved in my career, and honoured to be a part of it. Now, here's some of the things that you probably haven't been told by anyone, that if the technological trends continue for another decade, we will be on track to meet the Paris target of 1.5 degrees. And that meeting the Paris goals could actually cost less than business as usual. We should be doing it anyway. And that's not taking into account climate damages. That's trillions and trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars in some estimates more in costs. But we don't need that to prove that it's actually a cheaper system if we go with these learning by doing trends. Now, this is the killer graphic. If you understand this, you probably don't have to understand anything else. And this is a lot of time went into these graphics. So sorry to throw more graphs at you, but this one's quite important. What it's showing on the left-hand side there is the costs of various electricity generation technologies. You've got in the brown, black and grey, oil, coal and gas. And what you can see through time is these technologies, inflation adjusted, haven't changed their costs much through time. There's an explanation for that. It's the case with most minerals that you have to extract out of the ground and go further to find more, to more remote places. Contrast that with some of the new clean technologies like solar. You can see solar there in the yellow, literally coming down out of the heavens on a dramatic journey, and other technologies like wind in the blue, electrolyzers in the green for producing hydrogen, green hydrogen. There's battery technology, and the purple one that's kind of going up is nuclear. But what you can see is we live in interesting times. You know, they're all becoming in price parity, and around the world there are locations where solar is by far the cheapest alternative. And in actual fact, it's in some locations cheaper than maintaining an existing coal-fired power station. So it's a very disruptive time that we're in at the moment. On the right, and that's in a logarithmic scale. So once again, you've got those orders of magnitude between them. So fossil fuels not changing much. These other technologies coming down orders of magnitude on that decline. On the right-hand side is the other side of the story, the other side of the feedback dynamic, deployment. And what you can see there is an exponential increase in the deployment of some of these technologies, wind and solar. If you looked at that not on a logarithmic scale, most of those lines for solar and wind would be along the bottom. And then suddenly they would be coming up, and now they're about 10% electricity system. But there is a bit of a cheat to that in some respects, in that I can understand why people didn't see renewables as such a threat, because they're along the bottom of that graph, really. That's small amount of deployment in comparison to the entire energy system. But look at the consistency of that. And our question was, well, they're getting close to where the other technologies are. What if those trends just continued for one more decade? And you can see there that they're going to start getting up to where those fossil fuels are. They're going to start getting up to about 20% of the energy system, where they really start to compete with these older technologies on a global scale. And what are the implications of that? And as I said, this led on about 10 years of research of Doane Farmer around technological progress. You ask yourself, well, how can you possibly predict technological change? Talking to my father this morning about, could have you predicted what happened with the internet? We were both quite tech savvy at the time. We were on the early days of the internet, but none of us bought about.com, the domain name. We should have, because we would have made an absolute fortune. I met a guy who bought Massachusetts.com for $80, or no, it was about $10. He sold it to a lawyer firm for $150,000. Like, we should have done that if we would have seen what happened with the internet. So it's really hard to believe that people can actually tell you a story about the future and how technology will change the system. But actually, if you look at the trends of technologies, there are some really consistent trends. Once a technology gets established, one of them is that not all technologies are the same. That there is a graph of all the manufactured goods in the US between that time period. What you can see is that most of those technologies are around zero, so their costs don't change through time. inflation adjusted. But there's some outliers, some technologies whose costs have come down consistently through time at quite rapid rates. So the point there is that not all technologies are the same, and some are real outliers in terms of how much they can get cost declines through time. The other part of the story is the consistency of those cost trends. Those of you who have children have seen the costs, and yourselves have seen the cost of hospital services, college tuition and so forth, consistently going up through time. You've also seen certain technology that have kind of stayed the same. This is inflation adjusted again. But then there's other technologies like wireless telephones, computing, televisions that have come down through time. And look at how consistent that trend is. Year on, year out, they continue to decline. And so are there empirical laws here that we can fall on, that we can depend on? You've probably heard of one, Moore's Law, associated with computing, the idea that there is a doubling through time in the number of transistors that you can get on a chip, and that has obvious implications for the costs for a certain amount of grunt. That is a law that's associated with time. You just get this consistent decline in costs through time. An older law that's a bit different is Wright's Law, which is based on the work of Paul Theodore Wright, an interesting guy that worked in World War II on the plane effort, and he found in his factory that with cumulative production, they learnt and they got cost declines through time. And that cumulative production is a proxy for experience. And that's why these are called experience curves. And there's obvious implications for Wright's Law. But both of these laws work particularly well for a range of different technologies. There I'm showing transistors in black, photovoltaics in red, hard disk drives in green, ethanol in blue. And you can see both Moore's Law, which is through time, and Wright's Law through cumulative production. So every time you double production, you get a decline. They work well for both, for all these technologies. A lot of people have applied these laws to technological trends. The piece of work that we lent on in the work that we did was one from Doane Farmer and Francois Lafond, where they reformulated Wright's Law as a time series model that they validated on over 50 technologies. And what the value of it is that it provides an experience curves, the forecast with reliable error bars. There's standards of deviation there associated with their predictions, and they're reliable through time. And they've shown that on 50 different technologies. They can backtest them. They can go back in time and say, well, how well did they actually do? And this was published in 2016, and you can see what happened since then. They stayed within that first standard deviation. The recent kind of stoppages associated with COVID in supply chains have led to those costs flattening out. But look at what's the long-term trend. They're sticking still with that long-term trend. And that is the point, that the long-term trends are actually the best predictor of continuing cost declines for these technologies. And what are the implications then? So let's take one of those International Energy Agency projections, the one from 2020, and have a look at what that means for the energy system. So the fossil fuel there is in brown, grey, and on the bottom there, and you can see this slight decline in the fossil fuel system to 2040. You reduce the emissions that are in that yellow dashed line by 30%. Electricity grows, some of that from renewables, but they also use carbon capture and storage in that model. So the electricity price is a bit more expensive. It's a bit of a cheat in order to get those declines, but you see modest declines. And if you're a decision maker, you're like, okay, that kind of looks like it's progress, but not a heck of a lot, and it cost me more. So it was politically difficult. What would happen if we used predictable, the empirically grounded forecast methodology that we did for all these technologies, not just solar, but solar, wind, electrolyzers and batteries, the big four clean energy technologies, and projected that through time? You get a dramatically different story. most of that blue is, actually all of that blue, except for some gas, is from renewable energy sources. You get a steep decline, and actually we're meeting the same energy demand in that model, but EVs are a much more efficient solution to mobility, whereas your internal combustion engine is about 30% efficient, your EV is about 80% efficient, so you get some efficiency gains there that are quite dramatic. But look at the emissions from that system. That's 80% decline in the energy system by 2040. And if that sounds familiar, that is along the lines of what you need to do in order to meet the Paris agreements. So we thought we were onto something there, and so we built this model to say, well, what if we built our own model and applied this capability to an energy system model, and what are the implications in terms of the cost? So what we did is we took those fossil fuel projections and said, well, they're basically a random walk through time. We'll continue those on. And alternatively, for these 4 key renewable and storage technologies, solar, wind, batteries and electrolyzers for making hydrogen, for long-term storage, and for fuels like shipping fuels. And let's use our methodology that is quite different from those red line projections and see what the implications are. The red line projections are from the IPCC report, so we're contrasting those. We built an energy system model that was about 90% of the global energy system. There's components that we didn't include, like wood for cooking and some of the more difficult components, the nitty-gritty ones, because the idea was to make this model as simple as possible to really focus on this dynamic. And it's a transparent model that's out there for anyone to critique and look at. Unlike, I would say, some of these integrated assessment models, which are really hard and opaque to actually see how they work and why they come to the conclusions that they do. And we built different scenarios. We had one where you pretty much continue business as usual. So I'm going to contrast that to an alternative world where you fast transition to a clean energy system. And the way you do it is you replace your dispatchable baseload energy with renewables plus storage, plus batteries and some hydrogen. And for liquid fuels, even though you're replacing a lot of your petrol because you're using EVs, so you're electrifying a lot of things, you're still going to need fuels for some things, for making green steel, for shipping, for ammonia, for fertilizer. To do that, we convert renewable energy into hydrogen. And in South Australia, we're going to be doing that in the next 3 years. Once again, a world leader. So shout out to South Australia. They're the leader definitely of Australia, if not the world, in this regard. Now, with those 4 technologies, you can replace the entire fossil fuel energy system. So what would such a system look like, and what would be the cost of going with that system as opposed to business as usual? And this is the headline result. This is the abstract version of our storyline. We have that fast transition up the top there. That's going through time. The grey is fossil fuels, phasing out quite quickly. The green is the green energy alternatives. And then we have a slow transition where you don't do that as fast, and then a no transition. And down the bottom, because we use probability distributions associated with our predictions, our outputs are probability distributions. And what you can see there, that blue probability distribution is the cost of the fast transition. And what you can see is it's mostly on the left-hand side of the others. That 0 is the cost of the no transition. It's around 150 trillion, but that's what we would have had to spend anyway to meet the future demand for energy through time. So all these 3 have the same energy demand. There's no difference between them. We're comparing apples to apples, and we've done that deliberately to show that if you put your bet on these renewables plus storage technologies, you're going to get a probability distribution that looks a lot better. And the mean of that distribution is a saving of $12 trillion than the no transition, than the current system. So economically, it makes sense. You should be doing it anyway. They're actually, for those mathematicians in the room, log normal distributions. So you probably actually should be using the median, which means it's even more savings, 26 trillion. And because those are probability distributions, there are certain pathways we could go on where this isn't the case, that the clean energy transition is more expensive. But in all the thousands, hundreds of thousands model runs we've done, the renewable energy system is the cheapest 80% of the time. Now, that's an important thing to say because there's no surety to this. Like, my dad and I have had some really wonderful debates about whether nuclear should be a part of this system. I'm not saying it shouldn't. I'm just saying, as a decision maker, you've got to make bets. Renewables plus storage looks like a very good bet. 80% of the time, it's going to be cheaper, according to our analysis. And I can tell you that some of those high-end costs wouldn't happen. So that's actually conservative. And everything about this model was conservative, deliberately, to make sure that we could be really confident with the results. And in terms of the Paris Agreement and meeting those 1.5 targets, sorry, this is the last graph, but I have to do it because I said that was the main question of this talk, was about whether we could meet that Paris target. There's the three scenarios, the no transition going up in black in terms of their emissions through time. This is only for the energy system. The green, we decarbonise quite quickly. On the right-hand side, you've got cumulative emissions. So the green solid bar is the cumulative emissions from that fast transition scenario contrasted with the others. And on the very far right is those various scenarios from the IPCC of a certain amount of global warming. The light blue one is the 1.5 degrees. It actually says 1.9 there, but that's the watts per square metre. That's what that scenario is called. But that's your 1.5 degrees. And the white bar above the green and the others is the non-energy system components. So what that's telling you is we get the energy system to be Paris compliant if we continue these technological trends for another decade. We still have to deal with the non-energy system components, land use changes, deforestation. But if we can deal with those as well, we can meet the Paris targets. And that's not something that you would likely be hearing, but I think it's a very positive story because all we've done for that scenario is just continue current trends. And we are getting to the point where renewables are cheaper than their alternative. They're very disruptive. That train has kind of left the station. Not even fossil fuels with all their power is going to be able to stop solar from continuing on that journey, or even wind. Electrolyzers and batteries, that hasn't been such a long story and they've got a ways to go. We need to continue to subsidise and help them get to that point so that the system as a whole is going to be cheaper. But that is the key take-home message from this analysis. People ask me a lot about, well, what does that mean for different regions? Regions are different. They're going to have different amounts of renewable potential. This is a map of the solar potential of the world. So some places are going to be a lot cheaper than others. Yes, but the places that have deployed the most solar at the moment and have the lowest costs of solar at the moment are not the places with the best renewable energy necessarily. You've got China, the US, India, Germany. But they've got some of the cheapest costs because there's also a local component to this learning by doing. It includes installation, it includes connecting to the grid, it includes financing, learning how to do that. So there's a lot of components that you can actually get local learning by doing. But look at all those other countries that have huge potential. And a lot of that potential is in the equatorial zone. Wind is very complementary, and they're in the temporal zones. So you've got very complementary technology. And if you look at those countries that have put the most effort in wind, the same story. They're not necessarily the countries that have the best wind available. So plenty of room for progress. And the estimates for how much renewable energy we've got are from about 300 to 100 times what our current energy demand is. So orders of magnitude more energy than we use right now in the energy potential of the renewable energy system. It's dispersed and there's plenty of arguments about that, but our take-home message was contrast our story to what I told you is being told about the economic system and the cost of the transition from the IPCC modelling, that it's going to mean economic growth must suffer. You have to reduce your energy use. lots of carbon capture and storage, electricity prices are going to be higher. Our fast transition, as I said, you don't get all the way there because we're only doing the energy system in this model. But we didn't require any economic growth declines. All our models, those two models there, the no transition, fast transition, have the same economic growth. You don't have to reduce your energy use. They have the same energy demand, same useful energy. You get the efficiency gains, but you're still getting the same amount of mobility out of it. But actually, efficiency improvements are a good idea. They would make our solution even cheaper. So we should be doing those as well. And so the savings could be even greater. We've got no carbon capture and storage, but you can see we haven't met that. You're going to have rogue nations. We might have to deal with an overshoot, and we probably should actually go back to where we were in the Holocene in terms of how much carbon dioxide to be safe and not subjecting our children to it. So carbon capture and storage is still potentially a good idea and something we should invest in. But because we don't require that, our system has electricity prices that are actually 1/2 of business as usual. And to me, and maybe I'm naive, but that solves about half of the sustainable development goals, provided we do that correctly, provided that we make sure it's a just transition. But there's something in the nature of renewables, the distributed energy, that has a certain equity to it, which is in our favour in that regard. So in conclusion, what we've presented this at COP, last COP and the current COP, and basically what we're trying to say to decision makers, and we are getting through. This report has gone, I'm told, by the people in Oxford who are well connected to quite high up in the Biden administration. We talked to decision makers in the UK before the Glasgow Breakthrough Agreement, which is all about more investment by countries like China and the US in renewables. There's an opportunity to change the mood music that's being played to decision makers. I love that idea. Give them some nice music to listen to, get them more positive about this transition. And that is the continued strong investment in the key renewable and storage technologies over the next decade can put us on track to meet the Paris emissions reductions goal. They can mean that it would cost trillions of less than business as usual. We should be doing it anyway. If it wasn't for the vested interest in the old system, it's a no-brainer. And because we don't require a reduction in economic growth, it also means that we're not necessarily going to have to reduce our economic prosperity. In fact, the last time we got access to cheap energy, there was an industrial revolution. There was a huge amount of economic growth out of it. So there's a possibility for cheap electricity for everyone, leading to vast green growth. And that's something we're pursuing in South Australia as Australia's leader in this place. The fast transition is certainly not guaranteed, even though we're just continuing current trends. It faces obviously considerable challenges, one of which that I'm worried about is stranded locations, actually more than labour. There's more jobs in the new system, but there are going to be locations that become stranded, and that incumbent fight back. The federal government for some time in Australia, that's part of the reason why I was in Oxford, because I was sick and tired of that sort of politics, because it's quite obvious they're beholden to vested interests, and we're not gaining a lot out of that from what I can see. But there is also enormous growth potential, 10-fold increase in clean energy technology. That's a huge market growth. Now look at the possibilities we've got there, and it's very likely those costs are going to decline. It's a very good bet. So the last question is, what does it mean for you? Well, please vote accordingly to those that actually understand the benefits out of this. Obvious ones like reducing your consumption of meat. There's a new unusual part to this story, is if you've got the income, make sure your next car is an EV. So the weird twist of this story is that the rich, who are kind of put up there as the highest emitters, are also to some degree the heroes of this story, because they're buying these technologies when they're more expensive. And we need people to do that. We need people to invest in these technologies to drive down these costs so that we get these feedback dynamics happening as fast as possible. So put solar panels on your roof. If you're not, that's a bit of a no-brainer, that one. 3 years payback and it lasts 20 years. You should be doing that anyway. So, one extra component to the story that you can be a part of is investing in some of these technologies yourself the next time you go to make that investment decision. Thank you. Open to questions.
I'm thinking, Matthew, that soon as I've got the microphone, I'm going to ask the first question, and you probably know what it is. It's the question about, are we going to run out of resources to do this transformation? That's what.
There are some concerns, obviously, with the amount of materials that you need for this new energy system. It's a different type of materials. It's a system that's based on rare earth metals and copper for electrifying everything, which in order to do this sort of thing, we're going to have to produce 3 times more copper than we've ever produced in history. So real challenges in terms of how much ground we're going to have to dig up. The rare earth minerals are not necessarily rare, they're just associated, dispersed. And so you're going to have to dig up a lot more ground, a lot more tailings, there's things to deal with. And the countries that are producing a lot of these materials, the concentration is in the hands of the majority and only about 3 countries. For some major materials like lithium, Australia has actually got the largest amounts of lithium. We've got a lot of copper in South Australia. If you saw BHP buying Oz Minerals, that's a big copper play that's South Australia's a part of. There is a lot of mining that's going to come out of this, but in terms of the scale, the amount of materials that you need in order to build that new clean energy system, in terms of volume, kilograms, that is 1/10 of 1 year of fossil fuel materials that we use. So the materials that we're going to have to ship around the world to produce all this is a lot smaller. And it's a different kind of risk. We're dealing with the risk of the shortage of gas, for instance, right now, and our energy prices are going up and down. Look at the people that have solar panels on their roof and an electric car. They've got a lot of energy security at the moment, and they're not feeling the pinch. So the risk is different with these materials. Once you've got that system in place, you've got actually quite a bit of time of security, energy security, whereas the risk from loss of petrol or oil or gas is immediate. Every truck out there is going to be hit by an oil price increase. So yes, there is a lot of additional mining that has to take place for this system, but I'd hazard a guess the alternative of climate change is much worse than that problem.
So thank you, Matthew. A question online.
Thanks very much, Matthew. We've got a couple of questions from our online audience. I'm coupling some together from Roscoe and Miriam. They've said, thank you, but from an equity and sustainable development perspective, where should strong investment in renewables and storage best come from? And also, any thought about how to make solar, etc., available for tenants in rental properties?
Oh gosh, I'm not going to be able to do a good job of that second question. That's working on the micro scale. That's something I probably should have an answer to as the new Director of Economic Strategy in South Australia, and hopefully no one's watching from the government. Hear me say that. That is something actually we are working on, and there has been programs that have been putting solar panels on affordable housing, and I think that's an excellent program because, as I said, look at the affordability benefits you get from that and the energy security that you get from that. But you also, as we are in South Australia, are getting benefits from renewable energy being on the grid. There's a study that showed that South Australia pays $30 less than they would have otherwise. The costs have gone up. That's associated with gas and also some of the services that had to be added to deal with renewables. But still, there is a cost decline that's been associated with renewables in South Australia. So that's making electricity affordable for everyone. In terms of equity and where these come from, the materials come from and where they're produced, that's really up to us. I know China is somewhat maligned because of their human rights records and also the amount that they've invested in coal recently, but they dwarf the rest of the planet in terms of how much they're investing in renewables. They've actually invested more in EVs this coming year than the whole world combined. They have invested far more solar and wind than the rest of the world. And they're getting the benefits from that. Something that I'm working on in South Australia is us getting more benefits out of being a leader. China and Germany, that are the ones that have invested most in these technologies, are actually 1 and 2 in export dollars earned from these technologies. So if we do want to be a part of that and have that more equitable, we need to get into that game. And I think there is some benefits in certain sovereign capabilities in green energy, green materials, green minerals. And that's something we are working on in Australia, and something that we had our eyes open to with the supply chain issues associated with COVID, that we owe it to ourselves to get some sovereign capability in some of these important materials. And I think that will bring a certain amount of equity. And also, I don't think we're getting much in the way of tax from the export of fossil fuels. I've saw some articles saying that some of these multinationals are not paying any tax. We're getting very little out of exporting our fossil fuels, which I can't see the value for Australia in that. So, or more equitable, taxes on the exports of our fossil fuels to begin with would probably do something in terms of promoting this transition and also making it more equitable.
Is there a question from the floor? Just wait for the microphone to reach you.
G'day. I'm actually concerned, I suppose, in a very small part of the real world, I guess, is like basically renewable motor vehicles. And from what I understand, at least, using hydrogen cars for even just converting internal combustion engines using hydrogen would be a much better option than digging up half of the planet for rare earth minerals and also driving like with a much heavier vehicle on tires, accelerating tire wear and road wear. Is it possible that we could be putting a lot more focus on now on basically hydrogen vehicles as a practical option?
Potentially, I think a slight exaggeration about digging up half the planet. But yes, I understand your concerns. And in our modelling, I find that hard to believe that batteries are not going to win that race for potentially light goods up to passenger vehicles, light goods, and even heavy good vehicles. There's a role for hydrogen I see in really large vehicles. Shipping, for instance, will probably be powered by green ammonia. And just because the trajectory of the cost declines in electrolyzers, electrolyzers use a lot of water. In South Australia, with the projects that we've got going on hydrogen, we're having to do a lot of desalination to produce that water. Driest capital city and driest state, although you wouldn't know it, in the last 8 months, I've just come from the UK and my wife is like, you told me it would be sunny here. But it is a major concern, the water. But if we're producing that water out of renewables, then you're kind of going to water not being such a limiting factor. So I think there's also potentially a complementary technology between desalination and hydrogen that could be a part of bringing the cost down for hydrogen production. But I would be surprised, given the trajectories that we're seeing in battery technologies and capacitors. Capacitors are another part of the story that hasn't really made a major play yet, but a capacitor can hold a amount of energy, and it can be recharged very quickly, but it loses that energy very quickly. So you got a different strategy for it. Your drill will only last 5 minutes. It'll take 30 seconds for you to recharge it. So it's a different kind of story, but that has actually a steeper learning curve potentially than batteries. So that might be a part of the story. I know Tesla's working on capacitors being a part of nanotubes that are in the shell of the car. So when you go a certain distance, then you flick a switch and the capacitors recharge your battery and it goes twice as far. And the technological progress that they're making with batteries, when you think about the EV, this is a very different and new technology than an internal combustion engine. We're looking at the Tesla, that's the Model T Ford of the future. That's the first generation. They're going to get a lot better and a lot cheaper than they are currently today. And I can't see hydrogen necessarily winning that. I could be wrong. And I know there's companies like Toyota that have spent quite a lot of money betting on hydrogen. But it's a bit like the beta VHS, although I would say that most people already are betting on VHS at the moment. So, yeah.
I think we've got another question from online.
We do. I think this is our final one with half an eye on the time. An
We're
excellent
glad
question.
someone's keeping
Sorry
an
about
eye on the time.
An excellent question from Oliver, who was inspired by a book by Matthew Holton. He said, how would your modelling change if you took cost out of the equation and if we transition to a moneyless society and a sharing library economy? You're welcome.
That's wonderful. I was telling my father, I think I've faced every curveball having presented this, almost 30, 40 times. That one's a new one. Congratulations, Matthew. Great name, by the way. God, if we went to a moneyless society, what am I going to say in reply to that? I think that's a harder task than the energy transition to transition away from money. So I'm afraid I haven't given that a lot of thought. Oh God. And as an economist, I'm trying to think in terms of having an economy that involves money. Sally, my father's wife, is from China, and she was telling us some beautiful stories this morning about what it was like in China when they lived in a much more shared economy. And a part of me bemoans the loss of the Australia of my childhood, where we had a lot more public services provided by the government and it felt a more equitable system. If I was to transition to a more equitable world that was less concerned with private wealth and more concerned with a better world for all of us, I would be all for it. And I think the renewable transition story is a part of that. I remember when I first encountered a friend that had solar panels and an electric car over in California, and I came away from that stunned with the revelation that this guy had a level of security that no one else that I've come across had. He had power and he had, the battery from the car and mobility guaranteed. He was not going to have himself, when, things got really bad, subjected to the major shocks and mega trends that are happening in the planet as much as the rest of us. And I think that is the part of the story that's getting closer to where that equity that we're all, well, many of us are looking for. Possibly not those that are making a lot of money out of fossil fuels, but you're doing it at our expense, people. So please cease and desist.
We're getting the signal from Sarah there that we've run out of time. Speaking as a basically at my heart, a peasant farmer with an electric bike, the social changes that need to happen to support the technological change you're talking about, I think is what we need to bring together. And I like the idea of a society without any money in a way. But that's another conversation. Thank you very much, Matthew, for challenging us. And can I remind you that the Richard Jones Memorial Lectures are funded through a trust fund to which you can donate in the foyer. If you are able to do that, that would be wonderful. And also, by coincidence, there is a publication that's directly related to the work of Richard Jones, a print-ready editorial major research paper by Jeff Holloway, who was State Secretary of the United Tasmania Group under Dick Jones from 1974 to 77. It's shortly to go to print. And if you want a copy of that, then you need to order it in advance. And you can do that at the donation table as well. You can pre-order it, but you must do it by the 30th of November, because that's when they decide how many copies to print. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. And thank you very much. I hope we'll see you at the next Richard Jones Memorial Lecture. Thank you. And thank you, Matthew.